Hello, gentlemen. Welcome.
Hello.
Hello. Eve LaRose, and Adam. We'll see what the turnout is tonight. Could be just a small group of us.
How was it yesterday for the Chinese group?
We had 36, I believe it was.
That's really good.
Yeah, it's the most enthusiastic bunch. We had
awesome.
4 Chinese-only groups, primary speaking groups, and then we had 1 English group.
Awesome.
Yesterday, yeah, it's good. Qian, welcome. How did I do on that one? You're on mute right
now. Hello, everyone. Can you all hear me well?
Yeah, right? Sound good.
Great. Yeah, I just want to pop in and introduce briefly about myself. And tonight, actually, it's evening for me. Yeah. So I will cover Myra today as she is traveling. So I will take quick notes for all meetings today. And so I would greatly appreciate if each group could send me your notes. Brief written summary is fine after the meeting, so that this way I can combine all notes together and translate it into Chinese and share them with the Chinese community online, and so that this way they can have a better understanding of what we discovered, what we discussed today. So that way, it's really appreciated. And so I will enter my email address and Telegram username in the chat box below. And so if you can do that, that'd be great. Kevin.
Cool. Yeah, thank you, Qian. And I gave you recording privileges there, so you can record if you wish. Yeah.
Okay.
All right, we'll go ahead and get started with the basics here. They're pretty much the same every time, as you guys know, changing your name and all that. See, people will filter in here. I'm sure we'll have at least 50 to 70 people that will come in shortly. So here we go. Let's see. Share my screen. And we can, it's pretty informal. We can just we can discuss as many Constitution articles as you guys wish here, depending on how ambitious you guys are feeling. So week 4, here we are. The last call was almost 60 minutes exactly. We were pretty close. We'll try to keep this one about the same, I think. And let me get this little box out of your way. So this is the last week we're going to do Constitution version 1, the current Constitution, discussing Articles 10 to 20 this week. And we're encouraging everybody, of course, to host their own calls if you want, and we'll help you advertise them on the Alliance website and all the Alliance publications as well. We have a new Russian group that was started up by Dmitry with Meet One, and he also has been working hard with the Chinese group. And then we have June with EOS Ignite hosts a really good in-depth governance study group every Thursday, and he has one coming up this Thursday. I think it's 3 p.m. Eastern time if you're interested. It usually goes about an hour and a half to 2 hours. So everyone will need the mainnet Constitution, and there's June himself. He just popped in here. Hey, June. So the link to the Constitution, we'll pop it here in the chat so you can pull it up for your group. It might just be one group of us here, just all chatting together. I don't think we need to change our names or anything like that either, because we are pretty small. But we are allowing, so the Chinese group, they had some team names. There was Team Raven, Team Fox, a few different teams that formed before they came into the call. And so a few people got together and discussed in the same groups together. So if you ever feel the need to bring in some teammates and you want to be in a breakout room together in the future discussions, and you can certainly do that. Starting next week, we're going to be looking more at Dan Larimer's proposal, his intent of code as law, and diving into that, and then also comparing and contrasting with the current Constitution. And that way we can kind of figure out what are the best parts, what do we need to keep, what should we combine, and then we can start working towards rewriting or making some drafts further down the line. We're talking maybe a few weeks away, but getting closer. So let's see here. This is the sequence of this meeting. Pretty similar to last week because same format. We're just going to do, the later articles in the Constitution. So we'll do about 30 minutes of discussion. It'll just be the one group of us most likely here, unless we get a lot of people popping in. So it should be pretty easy to summarize. So I'll open up to you guys. I mean, so the first group, and Qian can vouch for this, but we went through Articles 10 through 14. Excuse me. We can certainly start with Article 15, which I think some of us discussed last week as well. the Korean group we did. But Article 15 is the infamous "you could lose your account after 3 years" article. And I'll stop sharing here. And the idea, of course, we want to dive in and figure out, what should be changed. I remember the sentiment last week for Article 15 was pretty strong. I won't say what it was. Well, I will say what it was. It was people want to get rid of it. Nobody wants that article at all. But I'll open the floor. What are you guys' thoughts for Article 15? I mean, let's. I'll post the Article 15 here in the chat for you guys.
Yeah, it's the termination of agreement article.
A member is automatically released from all revocable obligations under this Constitution 3 years after the last transaction signed by that member is incorporated into the blockchain. After 3 years of inactivity, an account may be put up for auction and the proceeds distributed to all members according to the system contract provisions then in effect for such redistribution. So pretty strong language. Obviously, you lose everything after 3 years. I mean, my personal thoughts as well, I think this goes against, it's in sharp contrast to the protection of property. That seems to be a strong sentiment throughout this Constitution and throughout a lot of you-know-whose work, Daniel Larimer. I don't feel it's necessary. I think we'll have more cases than not that folks who are just disappointed or upset if they lose all their funds just because they didn't happen to sign in or they were trying to hodl strong, whatever the case may be. What do you guys think?
Do we know if Dan is still in favor of this one? Because this was one that he was vehemently in favor for, and he even wrote the Thoughts on Perpetual Property Rights article about it, and he defended this one, and that was the only one really that he defended that much. So does anybody get a sense, or does anybody have a sense of what Dan's thoughts are if he's still in favor of this? It seems as though in the article, in the Constitution V2, it's not even in there anymore. So what seemed to be the most important and pressing article then suddenly disappeared. And the community sentiment at the time, I recall, was very strongly against this particular article. And we ended up saying at the time, let's leave it in because we have 3 years to deal with it anyways. And we knew that we were going to be redoing the interim constitution. I know that from my community, hello, Autumn, from our community at EOS Nation, the majority are against this this particular article. And so as a block producer, respecting our community's wishes, we would have to scrap this one. So we had talked about, and we had gone over, would we change the length of time, or could we create tools to automate somebody signing in every once in a while, or could you delegate? And it was basically all workarounds to still not participate in the network. And one of the primary arguments in favor of having such article was that we only wanted people in the network that were creating value to the network. And if somebody couldn't even bother logging in for 3 years, they weren't bringing any value. And so the idea was always workarounds so that the person could log in without actually logging in. So I would say let's scrap it.
I would tend to agree with that. I think that there are better ways, and I think he's already proposed better ways to keep people active and using their tokens, like dividends for staking, universal basic income stuff. Whether or not you agree with those two things, I think that those are it's essentially a non-force way to incentivize people to remain active in the Constitution. I would agree to remove this, because 3 years in itself really isn't even that long of a time, and you can't expect, as much as we would like to, everybody to read the Constitution. It's just most people, a lot of people don't care to some extent, and I think we can kind of see that based on how many people are on this call tonight, right? It's not like there's necessarily people beating down the door to talk about this stuff.
Autumn, to help catch you up, we are discussing Article 15 right now. And welcome, by the way. You're on mute right now. So
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah,
I had to take the call from my car, so
thank you for not driving at the same time.
I pardon the interruption, but it's good to see you all. Thanks for catching me up.
Is it a crypto Lambo?
Yeah, it certainly looks like a crypto
Not
Lambo.
yet.
I don't see those doors going up.
No gold wings on these.
Okay.
Is anybody taking notes on this? If not, I'll start a
I'm trying to take notes on this, but I'm also recording. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
So yeah, Autumn, you can probably see in the chat there. This is Article 15 is about losing your account after 3 years, and your funds being auctioned off to the network. Is that what it said? Auctioned off?
No. Well, so this is the clarification that Dan provided. The specific words they may be put off for auction, right? And so he focused on the maybe, and at the time the community would be able to determine whether or not. But realistically, are we going to? How many cases like this will happen where people don't touch their accounts and there's no activity, zero activity at all? Are we realistically going to go up for referendum every time there's an article, there's an account that hasn't been touched, and we're going to go back to the community to determine whether or not we should auction off those tokens? Even the system of going through that would be quite difficult to attain. And for what purpose?
Wow. Okay. So that's not one that I had read before. That seems like a very dangerous territory. I see the motive behind it, but spiritually, I'm not sure it matches to me everything that I feel like we're kind of doing here. Before you joined on, Autumn, so Dan, this was the one article that Dan was really vehemently in favor of keeping in, and pretty much the consensus in the community was to remove it. And the only reason why it's still in is because we have 3 years, and we knew that we'd be reworking the interim constitution. And I shared an article that Dan had written about it, about his thoughts on perpetual property rights, where he elaborates 3 possible scenarios, 2 of them being a cost to the ecosystem and 1 of them being a cost to the user. And he was saying keeping them in there is a cost to the ecosystem and to all other users, and putting that clause in and potentially redistributing those tokens was a cost to the user. And the cost to the user was to remain active sometime even just one action every 3 years. That was Dan's opinion at the time. However, in Constitution version 2, it's no longer there. Okay. So I was asking if anybody knew what Dan's opinion was of this anymore. He has been completely silent about this.
In direct reference to this, I think, go ahead. In direct reference to this particular article, I haven't heard anything from him. However, it reminds me of his current talk about the UBI/URI, the Universal Resource Inheritance, that he recently renamed. And his point with that is that nobody should just own everything forever, right? Instead of like past generations just being able to hand down land and property to other generations, and wealth just being distributed. And he says, wealth has been claimed throughout history by fraud and by violence and all these other illicit means. And therefore, resources should be redistributed in a fair way. And I think that's partly what this is laying claim to, this article itself.
That's a really good comparison, Kevin. You're right that I was talking to him last night, and that was one of his strongest points to make, was we are in this position we are today because of past violence, or I guess what he calls oppressions against peoples. And so you're right that there is a link here that I hadn't seen, where this redistribution kind of resets the tone, but does it really? Because all you need to do is write a script that does one action sometime in 3 years or 7 years, or I think 7 was the other mention at some point. So if really you can just create a workaround, a simple tech workaround, people could potentially go and download a script that would run on their computer or their cell phone or whatever, and it would render this article completely useless.
is it really worthwhile having an extra article in there?
I was going to say, I think the other point too that this article brings up is having an end to the contract. So if you do get rid of all of your tokens, there should be probably some point at which you're not under the obligations of a certain constitution, right? Some sort of statute of limitations, I think, was probably the other secondary minor point that he would typically bring up as well.
Yeah, he had clearly said at the time, would you ever enter into an indefinite, never-ending contract? No, you wouldn't. You would only enter into a contract that had a set end date. And that was another one of his arguments.
Here's a question of, oh, go ahead, Adam.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think out of at least the way that this is written, or the first part of it, rather, it could be reworked in some way, and that would still add value, because I don't see that anywhere else in the Constitution where, the obligations are ended at any point.
If part of the exercise, Kevin, is to go back to the spirit and the intent of the article itself, the spirit and the intent does seem to be, I think, like Adam mentioned, not being in a contract that's never ending. And also, I think it was the encouragement of people using and bringing value to the network. So would the article, could the article be rewritten with that in mind without having perhaps a termination of agreement? So instead of going from the negative side, could we come from the positive side to somehow encourage people? But then does it become a constitutional article?
I've heard you could liken it to bank fees. Banks charge a fee on your account if you're not using, for example, a checking account. You may pay $10 a month, and then if you happen to die, your bank account eventually will run out of money. They'll just drain all your money from your account. Could take 300 years, but eventually that property is no longer yours. And I guess a similar thing could be assessed here. Of course, nobody would agree on fees. Maybe there's some kind of incentive to then use your, if you want to claim your URI, for example, assuming that gets implemented down the line, you'd have to show some activity on the blockchain in a 3-year stipulation. Maybe that's kind of the intent of this. Maybe that's the grand scheme scope of what this article is trying to represent. I assume that's probably the route that Dan himself is trying to go. I hate to try and think in his mind because he's always so far ahead of everybody else. But and of course, I probably don't understand a lot of the things he's talking about too. But yeah, I think any kind of reworking of this article has to include some kind of incentive for people to jump in and try to use their account. However long the term ends up being, I don't think the number matters that much. 3 years was just kind of thrown in there, but like you said, it could have been 7, it could have been 10, who knows? But and that's the other question too. I mean, so with voting, for example, BP voting, there's that 1 week, there's the voting decay, and you have to revote to keep your maximum weight. Have people already written scripts for that, I wonder? Or are people honoring the intent of that? In terms of, we want everybody revoting and rethinking their block producer choices, researching ongoing. However, I don't know if scripts have been written or not. So that kind of draws a parallel to whether people might try to game this system as well.
Yeah, can I say something here? Sorry.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, so I personally think that over time this article would be removed because a lot of things could just happen, just make people come to use the blockchain automatically, like you said, using receiving URI, assume it's get implemented, or just getting people may have to vote first in order to receive those airdrops or those benefits from the blockchain. So people would want to get those incentives. People would want to get those benefits, so that this will make them automatically use the blockchain. Then this article would have no real effect. Or so my personal belief is that over time this article would have to get rid of this. Because everyone starts to use the blockchain.
I
think we have to think as well, what are the negative repercussions? So if realistically this will never get implemented in the sense that everybody will always find a way to log in sometime in 3 years, or scripts will be developed and somebody will game the system and then it will render the article useless. However, the perception of having such article, could it perhaps impede some people who would want to come onto EOS to not come onto EOS because of that fear that at some point, if I don't use my article, I think the examples that were used were I fall in a coma for 3 years because that happens very frequently. But without joking, people have that fear that it could potentially happen. And so would they perhaps not come onto EOS or not conduct business on EOS because there's such an article? So I'm thinking perhaps the negative repercussions of leaving this on far outweigh the positives of keeping it on, knowing that it most likely will get gamed at some point.
And Perry and June and Patrick, you guys are welcome to jump in. We don't mean to, I don't want to talk over you guys. If you have a thought, you're welcome.
Not at all. Thank you very much. My feeling on it is that I'm willing to let go of that article completely, or I'd be in favor of a decay similar to the voting. The feeling that I got from the information that I got from listening to Larimer was that he was most concerned on the pressure on resources, and he didn't want a bunch of people who just had tokens and to be consuming resources when other people could be using those resources, which is kind of one of the primary differences between the Ethereum network, where we have our guaranteed service level. And the impression I got that was his main concern, and I felt that was valid. So for me, that would the most I'd be willing to go on the article, on that particular article, is some form of decay, which I think you guys, somebody else has already mentioned. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll chime in here real quick. I think those are good comments about resources, and I understand Dan's, article about property. There's so much uncertainty in this whole blockchain space and EOS that I think it's probably better to try to limit any articles that are contentious and may just be something that we might not need immediate, just immediate kind of attention to. So I think it's something that maybe down the road, if the resources start to become scarce, then it's something you can consider down the road. But there's so much uncertainty with this entire blockchain and the space in general. So I feel like it's better to just try to limit any article to those that are the articles to anything that's absolutely necessary. And we shouldn't think so far ahead. Is just my thought on that. So.
Yeah, I definitely want to second that sentiment of absolute minimalism to the Constitution and this entire layer. I wish the arbitration group would take that same sentiment and really try to do the least amount. Not to change the subject, but they're kind of related. Putting the least amount at this base layer and really focusing and keeping it super simple and solid at the very bottom of the system, I think is an important design value that needs to be thought of. So I second that very strongly.
Sounds like general sentiment, and John, you might have better. If you can go back and sort of give us the points, the main primary points, maybe we can sort of figure out what our summary would be for this article if we were to summarize.
For this particular Article 15 here.
Yeah.
Right. So, well, that was actually a lot. So I would actually, I'll try to summarize the point here. So basically, I think, let's see here. So I think one of the main points that we just summarized was that people can understand Dan's concern about resources getting scarce moving forward. And we definitely understand why this article was in this position, was in this place when Dan brought this up. But there was also an understanding that because people may just occupy these resources and never use it in reality, so that this would prevent other people from jumping in from non-token holders to actually use the EOS to implement the EOS blockchain, because they would, if without this article in place in this constitution, then people might actually fear that if extreme cases happen to them, then they will start to lose all those EOS tokens and not being able to do anything, any business on the blockchain. So that was one side of concern that we think that we might need to keep this article in this constitution, but in a different form, in a different way, meaning that the wording could be rephrased to a more productive or more encouraging way, so that rather than scare people away from EOS blockchain, we may encourage people from actually implementing it by just rewarding or rephrasing this article. So that's one point that we came up with just now, and let's see if we have and also Perry and June, I think they both mentioned some to mention points of if or whether or not we should really look far ahead, like Dan Larimer is right now, to really. So I think their suggestion is that we should keep the current constitution or the updated constitution as simple, plain, and solid as possible, so that not to confuse anybody, not to confuse both token and non-token holders, both in and outside of the community, so that everybody could have a mutual understanding of what's going on, and so keep it simple at this point, and let's move on, and let's see how things go in the near future. I think that's the main point. If I missed something, please add. Please feel free to add.
Yeah, that sounded great to me. I mean, I think when it comes to the minimal asset, that's something we actually didn't really discuss, but people outside of EOS took that and ran with it, right? I saw Article 15 listed on Reddit outside of the EOS subreddit, and I saw it in a couple of news articles as well. It was certainly FUD worthy. You can lose your EOS. Yep. It's not immutable, or whatever they were saying, right? So I guess on that point alone, it's one of those things where we're causing unnecessary problems for ourselves in multiple ways, in terms of outside perception, but also, as Perry and Jun were saying, you're just adding a lot of overhead. Mm-hmm. Imagine if we do have some form of arbitration and people are losing their tokens after 3 years, they're all going to go running possibly to arbitration and asking for their tokens back, I wonder. I mean, I know personally, I think eliminating this article for now is probably ideal. And then that's just my end-all opinion. And then if we saw Dan down the line formally introduce his URI and said, hey, look, guys, we need something back in the Constitution that will allow, then we can do another, we can go back into this. As of right now, it's too early in my mind.
I've heard a number of arguments against it here tonight and in other places, but I haven't really heard any compelling arguments for it. I mean, if you consider just the fact that so many people are against it in the general public, there was such a negative reaction. That's important. That's important to consider, whether it's an educated opinion or not, whether it's correct, but it's something definitely to consider. Yeah, I haven't heard any really compelling reasons to absolutely have it in, other than the resource allocation. But at the moment, it's not an issue. So I think we're in safe ground by not necessarily going with it now and then waiting till it becomes a problem. I don't see the negatives of waiting. Waiting till we see a clear problem. So that's how I feel about that one.
Well, would you guys like to go on? We can discuss Article 16, if you guys are up for it. It's developer liability. And I'll post it here in the chat for you guys. I'll share my screen. We can all read it on the screen here. There we go. So members agree to hold software developers harmless for unintentional mistakes made in the expression of contractual intent, whether or not said mistakes were due to actual or perceived negligence. So we're leaving developers from liability.
I can start.
Yeah, go for it.
Be quiet here right now. So this particular article, I think, needs to be rewritten. I think so. This whole Constitution doesn't have any definition of terms at the beginning, so we would need to define what is a developer. Am I a developer? Are we all developers? Or do we, if we engage a developer and we do a smart contract on chain, aren't we all developers? So is that anybody and everybody? So we'd have to define that. And then what does harmless or unintentional mistake? How can we define whether or not it was an unintentional mistake? What if I say it wasn't my intention to create a leaky contract that stole all those EOS? Am I now exonerated from any potential legal ramifications of that? I think that overall catch-all particular article, I think, is not clearly defined. I think it needs to be a little bit more better written out so that we can protect unintentional, or I guess we can protect developers, but also we need to think of token holders and how to protect them in the context of smart contracts that are not properly written. So do we want to encourage any type of smart contract on chain, or do we want to encourage properly written smart contracts on chain? I know that in Dan's version 2 of the Constitution, there's an updated wording of this. So maybe next week when you go over it, you'll see the differences. But he himself has clearly evolved in his thinking since this was originally posted.
Let's take a look at that. Where's that at?
I think Eve is looking it up right now, frantically. This reminds me of last week's discussion. We talked about open source, which is Article 7. And there's that capital word D, developer, in there as well. Each member who makes available a smart contract on this blockchain shall be a developer with a capital D. I'll share that with you. Here it is right here. Each developer shall offer their smart contracts via free and open source license. And then actually, Article 8 is also tied in as well. I think, Adam, you guys talked about this in terms of putting the liability onto the person signing the transaction, that they know the translation is correct for whatever Ricardian contract they're signing. They are the ones that need to take responsibility for that. So it was kind of an extension of what ended up being, Article 16. I agree with Eve in terms of it doesn't make much sense to me. It's very, what am I trying to say? It's very, like he said, we're just assuming the good intent of the developer, whoever is making the claim, right? The all-powerful developer with the capital D. We need to define who that developer is for multiple articles. I think some of these earlier articles could be rewritten and even include this in it as well. Maybe some bullet points.
So I posted version 2, which is Article 3. Oh, you got some funky music going on. I posted Article 3 of the version 2 the Constitution that Dan had written. And the part that's interesting in there that's added on is the all parties are responsible for auditing the code and the Ricardian contract before use. So it adds that responsibility. All parties, we are all parties, the users are all parties, but the developers themselves as well are all parties. And so unintentional bugs, as long as perhaps you've displayed that you've gone through perhaps a third-party security audit and that you've done and you've taken all the steps necessary to ensure that your code is safe, I think that would render, that would perhaps give you the protection of this is unintentional. Look, I went through all of these steps to effectively show that my intention was not of. However, if something does happen, that you're still protected because of that portion. So it's that last part, I think, which adds a lot of strength to this particular article, in my opinion.
Patrick, I see you typing. You're free to, of course, Patrick, if you'd like to speak, you're on mute right now, but you can love to hear your opinions if you'd like. Probably busy typing.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the way, I think there are statistics that show, I don't recall, so I might be pulling this out of my Wahoo, but something like less than 1% of all the users ever read the terms and agreement services in a particular contract, Facebook or the likes. And if you add the Ricardian contract portion, so it does become human readable, and that increases the percentage of people that read the contracts, but that percentage does not increase to 90% or anything like that. It increases to still less than 10%. So the end user still, even though they have access to this, most likely is not going to be reviewing the code. So I think more of the responsibility falls on the developers. It doesn't mean that it exonerates the user from doing any due diligence, but I believe that most of the responsibility typically right now in a court of law would fall upon the developers. So again, it goes back to, have you done what you can as a developer to be able to indicate that indeed your intentions are good and you've done everything possible to show that that your code is well written, and if there is a bug, that your intent was not to write a bug or to create malicious software. Therefore, should there be arbitration or a dispute in the future, both parties would agree, I did not mean to write a malicious code, I did not mean to use software that had malicious code, all right, let's revert. And it would be a simple fix because it wouldn't be a dispute. Both of them would agree.
It's funny you say that, Eve. I was setting up an account for my girlfriend the other day, and I was showing her Scatter, and I was saying, look, Scatter is like your credit card, right? And you're just swiping the credit card. That's how you do your transactions. If someone steals your Scatter/credit card, you haven't lost your account, kind of thing, right? It was a very rough kind of way of putting it. However, I realized that Scatter, he's with his reputation system that he's putting in there, he's kind of in some ways almost eliminating or he's lowering the chance that people will actually read these Ricardian contracts, right? Because you'll see the review pop up, it'll say this is a scam or this is a buggy piece of code or whatever the case is, and people will just follow that, right? It's like Amazon reviews. I don't think, even though people are working with money here, I still agree that it's probably going to fall on the developer, right? Or it's going to fall on the developer tools that are being developed, like Scatter, like the Riddle system that he has there. Because the user is still not going to read anything, and they're going to lose money, and then they're going to take it to arbitration, and it'll become a very wet system. Very, as Perry was saying, it'll become very resource intensive,
clogged up,
everything else.
And also, I want to add to that. Knowing that I'm coming in from, I feel like part of my thing here is I'm here to learn everything besides the marketing side, right? Which is my wheelhouse, which is what I'm doing with EOS. But everything you guys were just saying, I agree with you. And the reason is, I feel like if our whole goal with this is eventually mass adoption, right? Then everything needs to be built with sort of end user protection in mind. And that having those protections built in from the ground up will bring them, right? If we make it more of like a, hey, you joined in, you should know the rules kind of thing, I don't know. I think that would scare a lot of people away. So seconding both Kevin and Eve on that one.
Thank you for bringing that up. Actually, sometimes we just talk about this and we forget about it, just like past cryptocurrency projects, right? Not user-friendly at all. And of course, that hasn't really worked out in some ways.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, it's the end user is all that matters, really. And that's how capitalism works. And either we're catering to them or they're not going to come. So
that's how movements work too, right?
Agree. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. Patrick.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to ask, is that an argument for the what has been posted as Dan's most recent update to that article? Is that saying that developers should not be liable for the damages of unintentional bugs, or that they should?
I think the way that the version 2 is written is very similar to the first version. So it does indemnify developers for damages caused by unintentional bugs. So that remains the same. But that second part that's added shows that the parties are responsible for auditing the code. And in reality, we know that the people, and it goes to what Patrick asked in terms of questions, we know that in reality, most users are not going to be able to read the code and or won't read the code. And so that responsibility does primarily fall on dApp developers. And if dApp developers want to have more mass adoption on their platforms and in their applications, I think the developers would be incentivized to go through a third-party security audit company to get that stamp of approval. And I would imagine that as a community, so as individuals, we might not read all the code and everything, but as a community, we might come up with websites that only post applications that have these stamp of approvals. And I know that while I was in China, there's already these websites that are being built because of games such as the werewolf game about a month and a half ago, where there was a faulty bug in the software and a lot of people lost their money. These third-party security audit companies are now pairing up with these software game developers or whatever, and they're creating these portals where if I'm an end user, I don't need to read all the code. I just go to this website that's now known and I check whether or not this application is certified on this website. So it still creates a responsibility for me as a user, but it lowers the threshold significantly, and it puts the threshold on the developer a little bit more to go out and potentially pay for that third-party security audit process. And I'm aware of current game developers right now that are going to certain companies to get that stamp of approval, because it creates that transactional certainty and confidence for end users. And if I have a choice of games to play, and I've got this one that's approved and this one that's not approved, as long as the UI and the UX to feed me those games is simple enough, I will choose the one that's approved more so than the one that's not approved. So I don't think it indemnifies the end user. The end user always has a certain amount of responsibility, but we need to create the environment that incentivizes developers to lower that threshold for the end users. So like what Autumn said, we have more people come on and we get more mainstream adoptability because it's easy to transact on the network and it's easy to create that trust tool on the network.
And we're creating the trust by allowing having the parties, like the developers and the users, be responsible. This is how we're developing the trust, or I'm referring to the article now, not to necessarily what you said about the rating system, which I think is a positive thing. But if we go back to the article, all parties are responsible for auditing the code and the recording contract before use. That's a positive statement.
If you want me to be honest as to where I think this article comes from, it's Block One covering their bum.
Okay.
Because I believe, so if like my honest opinion, Block One is going to be one of the largest developers on the network. Block One put this in to cover their ass.
Okay, so that's an important perspective.
I'm not saying I agree with it or not. I'm just the article itself. I think that's what the intent is.
Okay. Well, you're a developer too, right?
Well, I guess I'm personally not a developer, but sure.
Okay. I write code, and I've operated a cloud service for about 13 years, but we've all been able to read terms of service, and in most of the terms of service, there's all kinds of silly language that protects. Basically, we don't take any responsibility. There's no any kind of error. So this kind of very, very protective terms of service. So the users are used to reading that kind of language.
I would agree that they're maybe used to reading it. I will debate that they're not reading it. There's clear research and studies that indicate that people do not read the terms of service.
Okay, I accept that.
It's not even close. I think the percentage is less than 2%.
Okay. I like the idea of protecting and making the developers feel like they're protected, and putting the onus on all parties, not blaming the software developers or the contract developers for everything. It's a hard space. What I'm saying is, like, for example, if there's an application, one way to look at it is if there's an application that's being written and there's some kind of dispute within that application, isn't the application responsible to the user directly? Are we dealing with this at the wrong level? In other words, isn't it their responsibility in their terms of service to their customers, and it's up to the user of their service to read their terms. But if something happens in a contract at the system level, is it really on to the user, the end user, to understand these base level contracts? Isn't that part of the whole question of where do we arbitrate what? Are we going to really, is EOS really going to be arbitrating absolutely everything? Are we going to be figuring out which Amazon packages, or not Amazon, or maybe Amazon, hopefully Amazon, but some other company that's selling products? Are we going to figure out that the product didn't arrive or arrived damaged? Is that what we're talking about here? We're talking about contracts in this particular article, but I think it's important to really define what we're actually talking about. Just the contract is that contract developers not liable for damages caused by unintentional bugs. Okay.
I'd like to make sure Patrick has had his hand up for a bit here. Patrick, would you like to weigh in?
Yeah, hello everyone. Do you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you.
Okay. I just intervene in this discussion because that's for me something very important as a developer, software developer. And what I understand about this article is also regarding the last talk with Thomas B. Cox of last week or 2 weeks ago about the Ricardian contract and the smart contract and the Constitution, the law. So what I understand myself is when you write a smart contract as a developer, you cannot think about all the unexpected error that you can encounter. So you do your best. The code is the intent. You intend to do the best. It is not like Ethereum where code is low. Here we are in a situation where code is the true, and you do your best intention to create the smart contract. And you bind the Ricardian contract. It is mandatory when you create a smart contract in EOS, you have to bind a Ricardian contract that is human readable and also machine readable. So machine readable means by the smart contract. So in the Ricardian contract, what you write is all the case, unexpected case that can arise between your code and your users, your party with which you work. And in case where something is not expected, so in the smart contract, and there is an expected error, the Ricardian contract will supersede the Constitution law. This is what I understand also from Thomas B. Cox. When you are in your game, let's say you develop a smart contract for, I develop myself a smart contract for my customer, and I work with him in a good relationship. All the bugs that can arise will be taken from the Ricardian contract. If it is not possible to do by the Ricardian contract because that's touch someone else outside of my boundaries, that will be the Constitution law that will take the end. And what I understand now, the question here is in this article, now in the version 2, who will review the code? So for me, who will review the code? So in my team, for example, that will be my CTO, maybe someone else in my team that will see the quality of the code, if all is well written. And my question now for all here, if myself in my company, I am not a blog producer, I am only listening the blog by running my full EOS node. And I want to delegate the responsibility to review my code to someone else outside of my company. My idea proposal would be maybe to delegate that to a blog producer. For example, EOS Nation, because I am a good relationship with EOS Nation. And I want to ask to, I don't know, it's a proposal to Denis Carrière, that is a CTO for EOS Nation, and he is also a developer. And I want to ask him what he means about the code that I have written. That sounds maybe not so unrealistic, because it is also a developer. He can review the code. That's my question.
I didn't understand the question.
The question, I am a developer, I write my code. And you say in this article, who will review the code? So I say, aside of my team of CTO and senior developer, I don't think that a user can review the code, because the end user don't know how to write the code. So any people that can validate something in C++ in the smart contract or any programming language is someone that is a developer, right? So if it is a developer, that can be myself, but I am not the right guy because I develop myself. So I need to delegate that to someone else, either in my team, or if it is outside of my team, that could be, for example, someone that is working in a blog producer. Why not? And someone in a blog producer that knows how to develop, not a community manager, not someone that has no experience with programming. That should be, in any case, someone that has programming skills. And I was thinking about Denis Carrière, because he has programming skills by EOS Nation, because he developed tools. So I take this example. I can take another example. EOS Rio Igor Lins is also a developer, so he can also review code. That's my doubt.
I think you're looking to, if we are going to have some kind of non-liability, or if we are going to err more on the side of the user, where we want the user to be welcome to the blockchain, and therefore we're putting a lot of the onus on the developer, then we do probably, I think you're saying we need to set up some kind of a network, some kind of way for dApp developers to have their code audited, either by block producers, or it could be other dApp companies, or even the blockchain has security consultants or groups.
Also.
Well, I guess right now, under the current constitution, that's not a requirement. Under the current constitution, if we go back to what's currently written, the developers are completely held harmless for unintentional mistakes made in the expression of contractual intent. So what we're talking about is, what do we need to do if we want to either modify, rewrite, or delete this constitutional article? I think that if I understood correctly, Perry was saying we could even potentially just remove that article. Correct, Perry? Oh.
You might be on mute there, Perry, if you're trying to speak.
For me, it's not good to remove this article. It is a requirement, because you write a smart contract, you have to review the code. It's very important.
The way it's currently written, there's no provision for you to have to review the code right now. Current Article 11 does not stipulate that you have had to review or audit your code, or any party needs to audit the code.
Can you show me the Article 11?
Yeah, I'm pasting it into the chat right now.
So this is what's currently written, right? Developer liability members. So developer liability is the article. So members agree to hold software developers harmless for unintentional mistakes.
I don't speak about this article. I speak on the article where it is written in the Constitution that the party has to review the code.
So that is what was being proposed by Dan in version 2. And I was, the reason why I brought it up was the way it's currently written is maybe too loose. And the way that Dan has proposed it is a little bit tighter. But if I understood correctly from what Perry was saying, it might just need to go, or his suggestion might just be to remove it altogether. Correct, Perry?
I'll be honest with you. I am not absolutely clear on my position on this one. I'm not. The word that bothers me in the current clause, the most recent clause, is the word unintentional, and the idea of proving intent. I guess that's the business we're in, right? Is that what we're doing? We're improving intent, which is going to be proven by the Ricardian contract. But how do you prove intent to fraud? I mean, no one's going to write that in the Ricardian contract. So I don't know. It just seems very mushy to me. But this is all new territory for all of us. So the word unintentional, we're going to be spending resources determining what is unintentional. That seems odd, but
yeah, I agree with you on that. The word unintentional is too open, subjective, right? And that
it seems like it.
Yeah, the same thing came up in the language clause discussion from, I believe it was yesterday or last week that I was in. It's like, how do you actually prove that? And if there's multiple contracts, there's a language barrier and differences of language. So how do you even know if they intend sometimes between languages, because there aren't certain rushes or certain words or expressions in Russian as there is English, so it doesn't even exactly translate.
So if we go back to not at the application layer, if we just go to which contract do users currently enter that they will never have to sign a contract for, the only one is with EOS.io software. And who writes that EOS.io software? Block 1. Who's protecting themselves with this current constitutional article? Block 1. I think that's what it is.
I think, and we only have a couple minutes left here on the call. We're getting close to the end, but I mean, from my personal perspective, I guess we can sort of summarize our thoughts on this I know we're all kind of all over the map on this one. From my perspective, I mean, users, I understand Block 1 protecting themselves. Developers, of course, want to protect themselves. I kind of agree with Autumn. If we want this to be a user-friendly blockchain, these are transactions that are happening. And if someone loses money, it's painful for them. They're not going to come back, right? So we need to protect the user first. And that's why banks are so successful. That's why fraud prevention is so important for people. When it comes to money and their money, we need to put them first.
You say Block 1 wrote the code and give to the community, but the code is open source. So each developer has the right to download the code, make change, and do new version. And that will be the case when we will be on the sidechain. We are not still yet on the sidechain, we are in the mainnet. But tomorrow when we will be with the daughter chain and certainly the sister chain. And in the sister chain, myself, I can download the EOS software, do new version of the code. And in this case, the code is no more the code of Block 1, is already the code of Patrick. So in this case, the review of the code by the developer is very important. We cannot say, member agree to all software developer harmless for unintentional mistakes. I'm not totally sure of that. It's too open. It's very important to have a review of the code in any case, as in all software developer, software engineering. We cannot do a program and deliver and without review. And after, if it is not the case, we can say after, oh, no, we are not, that was unintentional mistake. And in this article, it's written, member agree to all software developer harmless for unintentional mistake. It's too easy to tell that, at my opinion, clearly.
Yeah, I just want to add something, sorry, real quick. So I think what Dan proposes here is, it's really to add the most outside layer to this question. My understanding of unintentional is that because if you code, you know that if your original intent was to produce something, some product A, then it may sorry, can you all hear me well?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So because I understand this article as for developers, for coders, if you code what your original intent might be producing some goods A, then you end up producing some goods B without knowing it. But I don't think Dan is pointing at the case here, because if you normally, if we coders, we would check our code over and over again. And if we are a company, we would, like Yves say, in China, we have a lot of third-party auditors, and we would partner with them and have a final check before release any product. Now, I think the intention here for this article is really if there are small bugs that cause anything that is not as harmful as one would describe as disasters, then Dan wants to protect developers by saying that.
I agree with you.
Yeah.
I agree with you. But normally the unintentional mistakes that should be covered by the Referendum contract.
Right. I also agree with that here unintental and yes, and developers should be clearly defined. Yeah.
And in the Referendum contract, we have to name, I don't know if it is the case now in the Constitution version 2, but in the Constitution version 1, that was written that in the Referendum contract, we have to name it an arbitration forum. And if we don't do that, it is the ECAF by default. But in the Constitution version 2, in the Referendum contract, it is always expected that we name it an arbitration forum. Because we speak here of unintentional mistake, and the unintentional mistake are taken by the Referendum contract, right? Right.
Yes. Right.
The intentional mistake, they are taken in account by the recordant contract. So in the recordant contract, you have also to name it the arbitration forum. So if you don't do that, it is ECAF. But in the version 2 now, how it is? You have to name it an arbitration forum in all cases? That's my question.
Sorry, no. In version 2, you do not have to point to an arbitration forum through the Constitution. It's not one of the articles as far as I am aware of. And I'm reading it right now just to confirm, but no.
Okay, you have no more to do this. And if you don't do this, that means the arbitration forum will be ECAF.
No, not in version 2.
So
but I think again, I think right now we're confusing two different articles and two different constitutions. I think the intent was look at the current article. Can we improve on it? Should we improve on it, or should we scrap it?
Okay.
What the intent was. So I think next week we're going to get into version 2 and kind of what our thoughts are on that. Right now, I think we're confusing a little bit of both.
Yeah, sorry, maybe. Yeah, sorry. Okay. So yeah, we agree on the fact that the developer have to review the code, and if it is an intentional mistake, the developer is not responsible. In fact, in this article.
Yeah, and I think we're all saying that it needs to be rewritten in some way. Unintentional, the word itself. Of course, okay. No developer is going to admit an intentional mistake kind of thing.
Okay.
To summarize my position on it at the moment, I would just eliminate the first sentence. So I think it's better just the second sentence rather than both sentences.
Oh, you're looking at version 2. So you're saying second sentence would be all parties are responsible for auditing the code and the recording contract before use from Dan's Constitution.
Yeah, and I think the effect of that would be that the software developers would then take on the burden of reviewing system level code, EOS code that they depend on, that their applications operate on. It'll be on their responsibility to do that, and their users would depend on them, who have the skills, are ready, willing, and able to make those evaluations of those contracts. And I suppose it's a free market solution from there. But everybody's responsible. So if you're a user, ultimately you are responsible. But if you use an application, I mean, just regular users just aren't just going to go on and somebody is writing an application, right? Somebody wrote every application that interacts with the chain. They wrote it. So those people are the ones are the most suited to review the code. And if you're a user, you should depend on those people to make those decisions. And so I think the smallest and just the tightest version of that one last sentence, all parties are responsible for auditing the code and the recording contract before use, is for me is better than that very mushy sentence at the beginning.
And for me, that would be more accurate if it is written, developers are responsible for auditing the code and users are responsible to validate the solution developed. Because the user cannot audit the code, because you need to have access to the source code. And the only one that has access to the source code is the developer, a software engineer, not the end user. End user has not access to the source code. So that could not be all parties are responsible for auditing the code. All parties should be replaced by developer, software engineer are responsible for auditing the code, and the users are responsible to validate the solution. And the Ricardian contract before use should be validated by all parties. That I agree. The Ricardian contract should be validated by all the parties in place in the game. But the auditing the code, it is not possible. All parties are responsible. For me, at my opinion.
Just to give a little bit of context of what's currently written in Constitution 1, Article 3 is open source. Each member who makes available a smart contract on this blockchain shall be a developer, and those developers shall offer their smart contracts via free and open source license. And so to say that only developers have access to the code, if the developers are indeed following the Constitution, is inaccurate, because everybody has access to the code if
I say what
they're following, Article 7, not Article 3.
I say what is written in the chat now from Kevin to everyone. It is written version 2 version. All parties are responsible for auditing the code and the Ricardian contract before use. I react on that now.
Yeah, this has been good practice for next week as well, as we look towards comparing the two constitutions, taking sort of the best parts of what we know. And so I think the general sentiment, the current developer liability Article 16 is just too mushy. The language doesn't make any sense. We clearly need the version 2 is closer. We probably need to just trim it down a little bit. June had a good point as well. We're a little bit over time, so we'll. Everybody's welcome to stay on if you'd like to keep on talking, of course. If you need to drop off, that's okay. We are open in chat as well, guys. If you could, anything we can improve upon. If there's one thing we can do better next time, we always ask for some feedback. So feel free to take 30 seconds or so and type something in the chat if you wish.
Can I make a comment?
Sure.
I don't want to forget what Autumn mentioned. And she was kind of being a spokesman for the users. I completely agree with that sentiment, because ultimately, in the end, that means mass adoption. That's what we're going for. If it's just a bunch of software developers, this thing is going nowhere. So we have to keep our eye on that. But that solution for the end users is going to be dependent on a very clean and clear and crisp solution at the base layer between the developers and all of that. So I don't want to think we ignored that sentiment, or I ignored that sentiment, Autumn. I'm very keen to that, but I think it's dependent on the base layer on getting this very clear. So that's all I want to say. I don't want to sound like I was ignoring that, because that is important. It is super important. So that's it. That's all I wanted to say.
Cool. Thanks, Barry. Yep, definitely bigger participation and audience. And yeah, we need to spread the word through all the channels. Definitely, I agree with that. And you guys, of course, your own channels, your own groups. Feel free to spread the word. Let's get this up to 30 people. One of the fun parts is coming back into the groups and hearing everybody else's perspective and what they argued about as well. So thank you guys for coming very much. And we'll see you guys soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.